Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for coming to this webinar. Hi, I'm Carla Chugani. I'm super excited to be here with you today to talk about some of the different ways you can de-stress the end of your academic year. So let's get into it. So this is me. I'm Carla. My pronouns are she and they, and I am Vice President of Clinical Programs at Mantra Health. Before I worked for Mantra, I was a professor at the University of Pittsburgh in the medical school. Still live in Pittsburgh and love it here. And I'm an expert in college mental health. So I had some really difficult mental health problems when I was in college, and that motivated me to choose a career that would really allow me to spend my life trying to make things better for young people dealing with some of the same problems that I had. So I'm super excited to be here with you today to share some tips for maintaining your emotional well-being. Some of the things I'm going to chat with you about are thinking through what causes anxiety and stress, recognizing the impact of our stress on our minds and bodies, developing some new coping strategies, and building some tools for the future. But before we get started, I just want to acknowledge that we've been through kind of a hard time, right? COVID has made things really challenging in a lot of different ways, and it has been a very intense couple of years. Even though things have kind of gotten back to feeling a little bit more normal, the impact that all of that chronic stress has on us is not just going to go away. And then adding to that, we're at the end of the academic year, and it's just normal to feel worn out, tired, or just feeling a little like draggy, lacking in motivation to keep pushing forward. So we are going to be discussing some specific skills to help in coping with these feelings. But I just also wanted to really start off by letting you know that it's okay to ask for help and to remind you that you're not alone. And I'll definitely be sharing some mental health resources before the end of the presentation if anyone is feeling like they do want to reach out for help. All right, so let's get into it. I want to start with just a little overview of what stress and anxiety actually are, and then we'll dig into how we cope with it. So stressors are the actual situations that trigger our bodies to respond. So that could be exams, a deadline, a bear chasing you, right? And then stress and anxiety are the physiological and psychological responses to these situations. And that could be a lot of different things. It could be a behavior, like I run away from the bear that's chasing me. It could also be having a hard time sleeping or ruminating, right? Thinking about that problem and not being able to kind of turn my mind off. And this stress response, right, you might be familiar with it as our fight or flight response, is actually a survival mechanism that helps us respond to perceived dangers in our environment. The challenge is that in today's world, we can have this stress response get triggered even when we're not actually in danger, right? In terms of the difference between stress and anxiety, stress is usually shorter term. It's going to resolve when the stressful situation resolves, whereas anxiety is more persistent. One thing I want to highlight, though, is that there's a certain amount of stress or anxiety that's actually can be helpful and adaptive for us. So when we have no stress at all, we might feel kind of like bored or apathetic. It might be hard to motivate ourselves. And then on the other hand, when we have way too much stress, it can feel like paralysis, right? Like we're so stressed out that we feel fearful of doing anything, or it's just hard to function. But there is this middle spot. There is this sweet spot in the middle where a little bit of anxiety or stress actually really does help improve our performance. All right. So, in terms of recognizing what causes stress and anxiety, especially at the end of the academic year, it honestly can be a lot of different things, right? So, I have a couple of examples on the slide, but this is not exhaustive, right? So, it could be things like pressure to succeed. It could be life changes. So, for example, in my career, I have worked with lots and lots of college students, and sometimes they're really anxious when they're starting college because it's a huge transition. But I also see a lot of students get really anxious when they're about to graduate, because it's like there's this huge amount of unknowns that you're coming up against after this period of kind of really being in your groove and in a campus community. Sometimes people struggle with perfectionism. I happen to be one of those people. It stresses me out a lot. We can have cognitive distortions, which are patterns in the way we think about things that can sometimes cause us to experience emotional distress. So there's lots of different cognitive distortions. I won't get into all of them today, but I'll tell you my favorite one, which is called catastrophizing, right? So anytime you come up against a problem, it's a total catastrophe, right? You react to it with the intensity as if it's a catastrophe, rather than seeing it most of the time as kind of a solvable problem. But there's lots of things besides what's on this slide that can stress us out. So, not having enough money to pay our bills, to access food or other basic needs, that is a really important cause of stress. Experiencing discrimination or harassment, right, causes chronic stress. There's lots of different things that can cause this. And so it's important to spend some time reflecting on what your stressors are, simply because it might change what strategies you use to cope. So somebody who's dealing with perfectionism is not necessarily going to want to use the same strategies as somebody who is dealing with financial stress. So the next thing I want to talk about with you is the importance of being able to recognize the impact of stress on your mind and your body. So our bodies and minds give us signals that let us know that we're stressed. And sometimes before I even realize that I'm really getting stressed or overwhelmed, I notice certain symptoms. So for me personally, I happen to have some unfortunate gastrointestinal symptoms. I have digestive issues sort of all the time. And so one of the first things that happens to me is I get a stomach ache. And I start to feel nauseated. And that is typically the first sign that I'm really getting too stressed out. I feel it in my body. It could also be in your mind, right? It could be having a hard time concentrating, getting stuck on thoughts and ruminating. And it could also be emotional, right? It could be feeling irritable or edgy or kind of, prickly. So I'm just wondering if some of you would feel comfortable just to drop in the chat, where do you notice stress come up for you, whether it's physical or emotional or cognitive? Yeah, so lots of different, we're all different. And, some folks are like me and have a lot of physical stuff. For others, it's like definitely emotional. And then for others, definitely cognitive. Yeah. And then sometimes all of them. Yeah. And so somebody's bringing up as well, not just tummy aches, but headaches. Right. It could be you're extremely tired, could be you can't sleep. Right. I get both sometimes. So there's a lot of different ways that we can feel the effects of stress. And one of the things that I want to highlight for you here, the reason that I'm beginning this presentation with this is because these symptoms, although they don't feel good, are a useful way of knowing, of becoming mindful, of becoming aware of how we're feeling. And that awareness is really important, because at the highest level, you can't solve a problem if you're not aware that the problem is occurring, right? So one of the things I just want to encourage you to do is think about, what are the signs that I'm getting too stressed out and I need to do something to take care of myself, and use that not as like a, oh gosh, this is happening again. It's not a bad thing, but use it as like a, oh wow, this is great. Now I'm mindful of this. Now I can do something about it. Does that make sense? So before we get into some of the specific skills that I want to teach you today, I also want to ask you to consider a question for me. And if you feel comfortable sharing in the chat, I would absolutely love to hear from you. So here's my question. How intentional are you about choosing your coping skills right now? So if I put that another way, when things get hard, how thoughtful are you about choosing how you're going to cope or react? Okay, and I'm seeing in the chat, again, there's kind of a spectrum. Some folks are saying, yeah, I'm really intentional. Others are more on the side of not so much, or not as much as I wish, and then some kind of right in the middle. And again, there's no wrong answer for this, right? Whatever you're doing is fine. And the only reason that I'm bringing this up is because most of the skills that we teach for emotional health, for stress management, for anxiety management, these skills are not rocket science, okay? They are usually simple, practical tools that anyone can learn. The challenge, what I've found when I teach this to college students who are usually super smart and with it, is that sometimes students will sort of say, you know what, if it was this easy, I'd be doing it already, right? It can't really be this simple. So the thing I want you to remember, the reason I've asked you this question, is because the hard part with these skills that we're going to go over is actually remembering to use them when it matters, right? When you're emotional, it is hard to hold back your gut reaction and instead kind of try to be really intentional and thoughtful about what can I do in this moment that's really going to be effective for me? That's the part that takes a lot of practice, is remembering to take a deep breath, take that pause, and really think about, okay, how do I want to respond here? What is actually going to work for me? So the skills that I want to teach you today are divided into skills to use when you're in a crisis, and then skills for times when you're not in a crisis. So the first thing that we need to talk about is, how do I figure out which skills to use? So if you think about your emotions as being on a thermometer ranging 0 to 100, where 0 is no emotions at all, and then 100 is most intense possible emotions, that's going to help you gauge where you are emotionally at any given point. In therapy, we call this a SUD scale, subjective units of distress. But usually when I'm teaching like this, I just use a thermometer because everybody knows what it is. It's easier to understand. So remember, your emotions can be positive or negative, right? So you could be at a 90 on this thermometer because you're super nervous about an exam, but you could also be at a 90 because the person you like just asked you out, right? So in general, a crisis level is really just, for the purpose of these skills anyway, a crisis level is just kind of, are you at or above a 65? It doesn't necessarily mean that anything is wrong. It just means that your emotions are intense enough that it might interfere with your decision making. So if you're at or above a 65, you're going to use crisis survival skills. And part of the function of that is really to just kind of get the emotional intensity down rather than solving the problem per se. And then if you're under a 65, or once you get yourself there, that's when we can do problem solving skills. So there are a lot of different crisis survival skills that you can learn, but the TIP skills are some of my favorites. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. TIP is an acronym that stands for temperature, intense exercise, paced breathing, and progressive muscle relaxation. The reason I wanted to teach you all these skills is that one of the things that can be very distressing for some people are those physical sensations that come along with intense emotion. So think about like your stomach just drops, your heart starts racing, you start sweating, right? And so these are skills that are all ways of helping to change your physical reaction to an emotion that you're experiencing. So the first one is temperature. And basically what we do with this skill is we're going to activate the dive reflex, which is a reflex that all mammals have. This skill, I will say, total disclaimer, it really does slow your heart rate down extremely quickly. So this is not a skill to do if you have a history of heart problems. So how do we do the skill? To do it, you need a big bowl of ice water, actually. And what you're going to do is you're going to dunk your face in the ice water, which I know sounds a little nuts, but just hear me out. So when you expose this part of your face right here, so these little sinus cavities right here, to very cold water, it simulates the dive reflex, which is a reflex that mammals have that kicks in when they jump into or fall into very cold water. And so what you do is you get your big bowl, you put ice, you put water, you bend over at the waist, you hold your breath, and you put your face in that cold water. Don't force yourself to stay underwater for any longer than you can comfortably do, right? You can come up for air and face dive again. But this really will bring your heart rate right down. So think about those moments where you're really kind of panicking. This is a great skill for that. Okay, so what if you don't have ice water? There are some alternatives. So sometimes what folks do is they will keep an ice pack in their freezer and kind of hold it in this same area. So this forehead and eye area. You do need to be careful with that as well, though, just because you can get an ice burn. The I stands for intense exercise, and exercise is a great way to relieve stress and let out pent-up energy or anxiety. When emotions are feeling really intense, getting in some exercise that's intense enough that actually gets your heart rate up a little bit, it releases endorphins, which are chemicals that help your body reduce stress and pain. Regular exercise, so doing it sort of as part of your regular routine, improves the level of serotonin in your brain, which can boost your mood and your sense of well-being. Now we're on to the P's. So the first P stands for paced breathing. And the way this works is you just want to make your exhale longer than your inhale. So inhale for a count of 4, exhale for a count of 6, for example, whatever works for you though. The reason this one works is because when you inhale, your heart rate actually speeds up slightly. And when you exhale, it will slow down slightly. So there's a bunch of different things going on here. When we intentionally increase our heart rate variability, that reduces stress. But there's also a cognitive component, right? Which is I'm focusing on counting and breathing, which gives me my mind something to focus on and helps me calm down a little bit. And then the final P is for progressive muscle relaxation. And this is a simple exercise where you progressively tense and relax the muscles in your body. Typically, people do this starting at the feet. So you might begin by tensing your feet for 5 seconds and then releasing them for 5 seconds. And then next, you tense your calves for 5 seconds and then release for 5 seconds, and keep going, working your way up the body until you get all the way to the top of your head. This is an exercise you can do it seated, you can do it laying down. It's absolutely wonderful for tension release. And it can also be a great one if you have a hard time turning off your mind at night to be able to fall asleep, because it does give your mind something very specific to focus on instead of focusing on those worry thoughts. And then it's very physically relaxing as well. So if you're interested in trying out progressive muscle relaxation, there are lots of different free resources for this, guided practices. You can check out YouTube, you can check out your socials. It's pretty much everywhere. All you have to do is Google it. Okay. So before we get into the next section of skills, I would love to hear any thoughts you all are having about the tip skills, as well as other ideas or suggestions about what works for you when you're trying to bring that emotional intensity down quickly. I also deeply want to know if anyone is going to try the face dive. Okay, so we've got some great stuff in the chat, right? Sleeping, definitely. Listening to music, writing my feelings down. And we've got some folks that are like, nope, the face dive's not for me. And then others that are like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to try that. And you know what? That is wonderful. And I love that for all of you. With all of the skills that I teach, the point is definitely not to tell you all the right way to do things according to me. It's really more about exposing you to some of these different techniques and then hoping that you'll pick the ones that make sense for you, that make sense for your body, the way you like to handle your emotions, and use those. So if you can find 1 or 2 things that are helpful that you think I could really take this back with me from this presentation, that's a win. You don't have to try every skill. Okay, so now I want to transition into talking about some skills that you can use when your emotions are not at a crisis level. So in other words, you're lower than a 65 on that thermometer. The first one I'm going to talk about is called cognitive restructuring. Sometimes it's called cognitive reframing. It is a basic and very helpful process for changing unhelpful thoughts. So if you're anything like me, you might have thoughts from time to time that don't really reflect reality, right? I'm not good enough. I'm not going to be successful, those kinds of things. And so this is a skill for dealing with those kinds of thoughts. And then we're also going to talk about problem solving. And I know that might sound simplistic because y'all are college students. You have had to solve problems before and you do it every week. So the reason that I included problem solving today is because one of the things we know about how the brain works is that when emotions are more intense, it actually gets progressively more difficult to engage in complex cognition, right? The more intense your emotions are, the harder it is to think clearly and rationally. And so sometimes it can be really helpful to have a problem solving kind of like formula or procedure that you can just follow in those moments when you're feeling kind of helpless or overwhelmed. That is also probably the reason that some folks really like to use a pros and cons list. It just sort of makes it easier to sort through all of your thoughts. Okay, so I'm going to take a deeper dive into each one of these skills now. So here you can see an overview of the steps that are involved with cognitive restructuring. The first thing you need to do, and feel free to screenshot this so that you have the steps. First thing you need to do is identify the event or the trigger. So what happened that got you stressed out? What happened that caused anger or anxiety or fear or sadness or whatever the emotion was? The next thing you're going to do is identify the emotions you're feeling and rate them on that same 0 to 100 scale. So you might say, I'm feeling anxious and I'm at a 75, right? Or I'm feeling fearful, I'm at a 40. And then the next step is to actually state the unhelpful thoughts that are fueling these emotions. So some examples from my past, I'm never going to get into graduate school. I will never find anyone else who I love as much as I love this person who just dumped me in a really humiliating way, right? I'll never get over this. And then now here is where the real work comes in, because the next step is that you've got to identify a more helpful or reasonable or realistic thought. It has to be something that you actually believe. We can't just tell ourselves like, oh, it'll be fine, I'll get over it, when it's not fine and we're clearly not getting over it, right? That does not help us feel better. The trick here is to start to be able to see where your unhelpful thoughts are not actually reflective of reality and replacing them with a more helpful or realistic thought. So again, like when you're upset, this requires you to push yourself a little bit. So going back to my humiliating breakup, right? I've been dumped. I'll never find love again. A more helpful thought might be something more along the lines of, Carla, this is really painful. This really sucks. This is really not how I wanted this to go down. And I've been through enough relationships to know that eventually I am going to feel better. I will probably get over this, and there are things I can do to try and meet someone new. So once we have that more helpful thought, we bring our attention back to how we are feeling and we re-rate the intensity of our emotions again. So maybe I was at a 65 on sadness when I started, and now I'm at a 35. So my emotion didn't go away, but the intensity of it came down when I started telling myself something that was more realistic and helpful, rather than sort of spinning and spiraling around this narrative of, oh, I'll never get over it, I'm so humiliated, and these kinds of things. So I put an example here just to help further illustrate how cognitive restructuring can be used when you're feeling upset. When you first are learning to do this, it can be very helpful to write all of the steps down just to make sure you're not skipping over anything. There are lots of free worksheets available for you to download on the web if that's something you're interested in. Eventually, if you practice this regularly, you will be just like me. I just rattle it off in my head. And it doesn't take that long. It's only 6 steps. So I believe in you that you can learn this. So just walking through this example, I just realized I turned in my major final project and I have a huge mistake in it. I am freaking out. I am anxious at a 75. I am ashamed at a 30. And what I'm telling myself is, oh my gosh, I'm so stupid. How could I have done this? I'm going to fail the class. I won't get into grad school. It's going to mess up my GPA. And so then if I challenge myself to think about what are some maybe more realistic thoughts, one of the things I tell myself quite often is, Carla, remember, Even smart people make mistakes sometimes, right? Everybody makes mistakes sometimes. It actually is not a reflection of my intelligence or my worth. One mistake is not going to define my entire educational experience, right? There are things that I can do to try and fix this. And then if I go back and re-rate my anxiety, I'm at a 30 now. So again, it hasn't gone away, but it's really brought the intensity down so that I can think about what's the next thing I'm going to try here. And so that brings us to problem solving. So again, we have 6 steps. Feel free to take a screenshot. The first thing we want to do when we're trying to figure out how to solve our problem is define the problem in detail. It's really important to just stick to the facts of the situation and try and be non-judgmental. So if I describe my problem as my roommate is a jerk, that's not really a solvable problem, right? And it also doesn't tell you very much about the problem. Whereas if you describe the problem as, my roommate doesn't clean up after himself and he makes noise when he knows I'm sleeping, those are specific and solvable and addressable with that person. The next thing you'll want to get clear about is, how does this problem interfere with my goals or my needs? Because if it doesn't interfere with my goals or needs in any way, then it's probably not my problem. I would say the one exception to this is something that goes against my values, right? So something might not technically be hurting me, but it could go against my values. If I see somebody saying something that's racist, right, and I have a value of being an ally to that community, I'm going to address it, right, because it's aligned with my values to do so. The next thing you're going to do is brainstorm all of the potential options for how to solve your problem. There's no wrong or bad ideas. Just get it all out. What's every possible thing you could do? And then once you have your list, start to narrow it down. Pick your top 3. Think about the pros and cons of each and pick the solution that you think overall, this one's the best one for me. And then list out the steps needed to implement your plan and take that first step. Now, if it goes great, good, you're done. If it doesn't work so well, you just go back to that short list that you made, pick another solution, and try again. So before we end, I want to look at an example of problem solving in action. And I picked this example based on how I'm imagining some of you might be feeling right now. So if we define the problem, I am feeling exhausted from the end of the semester, and I haven't had my normal motivation to get my work done. And in terms of how that interferes with my goals, well, I want to graduate on time. I want a certain GPA because that's going to increase my chances maybe of getting an internship or grad school admission or something like that. And so then let's brainstorm some options, right? What are all the things we could do depending on how seriously we're struggling right now? I could talk to somebody at my counseling center. I could talk to my academic advisor. I could talk to some friends having the same problem. I could say, you know what, I've got this. I just need to increase my self-care a little bit. If I'm religious, maybe I go to a service or I seek religious counsel. I could talk to my doctor. I could ask my professors for help. I could talk to my family, right? I could show up to this webinar. There's a lot of different things I could do. And so then let's say our top 3 are maybe increase self-care, talk to a therapist, and ask my professors for help. So which one would you pick? Drop it in the chat. Okay, so we've got to vote for seek counseling. Would anyone ask a professor? Therapy, ask my professor. Great, okay. Would anyone pick self-care? Yeah, this is great. So lots of folks in all the different buckets. And again, the reason for that is it depends on what's going on with you. If you feel like you're a little burned out, but you're basically doing okay, you're probably going to pick self-care. If you are fully burned out, overwhelmed, and really struggling, you're probably going to talk to a therapist. And if it's more of like a logistical issue, or maybe you just have a really good relationship with the professor where you know that if you need a little bit of extra help or space, that professor is going to give it to you, you go to the professor, right? So you sort of weigh the pros and cons of each depending on what works for you. And then you take that first step. So before we wrap up, I want to remind you all that there are a lot of resources available both on and off campus to support your well-being. Again, feel free to take a screenshot here so you can have a reference of some of these things. And just again, want to remind you, this can be a very stressful time of year, and please don't hesitate to reach out for help if you're feeling like you need it. So I just want to review some high-level next steps with you. We learned a few different coping strategies today that I really hope were helpful. And I want to encourage you to be proactive and really start thinking about how are you going to use these strategies in your own life, as well as recognizing when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed to the point that where it might be time to ask for help. I also want to highlight, as a thank you for attending today, we are doing a giveaway. So my fabulous colleague, Michaela, is going to be in touch with you if you've won one of the gift cards that we are giving away. And I thank you so much for attending today's presentation. And I would be glad to answer any questions that you have. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and otherwise we can wrap up for the day. Okay, it looks like Isabella has a question, but I can't see what it is. Okay, am seeing a question in the chat. How can we assist others in coping with stress? So I think that the most important thing that you can do if you're seeing a friend who's really struggling is actually just to be supportive and compassionate. So don't necessarily try to tell them what to do. But do offer a supportive ear and assist them in getting some professional help. I would also say if you see someone who's really struggling and they are not willing to get help, that's a situation where it can be important for you to talk to somebody about what's going on and get your own support to make sure that if that person needs something, they can get linked with it another way. So you can talk with, really anyone on your campus is going to be able to support you in a situation where like maybe you're really concerned about a friend. I'm also seeing some questions about, when do these techniques work and when don't they work? So we've got a couple of different questions to that extent. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So there's certainly no guarantee that these skills are going to work for everyone or that they're going to work every time. all of the skills that we reviewed today are evidence-based skills. So there's a lot of research that supports using these as ways of managing stress and anxiety. And, there are no guarantees in life, right? That is just part of how it works. So generally what I suggest is that if you try a skill and it doesn't work, then try something else, right? So especially when you're first learning how to manage your stress, or even if you've managed stress in the past, but now you're in a new situation, and then you can, sometimes the coping skills that you used in your previous stress don't always work for the new stress. So you've got to try something different. And if you're really feeling like, you know what, none of this is working, I'm trying all the things, I'm using my self-care as much as I can, and it's really not working, then that is typically when I would say, talk to a counselor, get some support, get some support from a professional. All right. The next question, does high-level stress have effects on people's personalities and mental state, even after the stressful period has passed? A lot of people say it doesn't matter how bad it gets if it's only for 4 years. How would you address that? That's a really cool question. Yeah, so chronic stress actually has enduring effects on us. It actually has really important and long-lasting health effects as well. And so I am not I haven't studied this in great detail, but absolutely experiencing high levels of stress, especially chronically, which 4 years of stress, of high levels of stress, is definitely chronic stress. That will absolutely have an impact on your mental health and your personality, as well as your behavior and your physical health. Chronic stress is really not good for you in terms of both your emotional and physical health. And that's part of the reason we did this webinar today. Managing stress has so many positive benefits. Okay, and last question. Can exercising regularly help ease stress? Yes, absolutely, it can. So as I mentioned in the tip skills, regular exercise actually boosts serotonin. And there has been some research to show that regular exercise actually can have a similar effect on your brain as taking an antidepressant. So it's absolutely great for stress relief. It is also great for your mental health. All right. Can a lot of sleep reduce stress? So sleep has pros and cons. Sleeping too much or too little is generally not good for you. So sometimes when we're really stressed out, escaping from it in some kind of way. I see that there's a question about escapism in the Q&A as well. There are a lot of different ways that we can escape from our stress. Sometimes we sleep, sometimes we watch our favorite show on streaming, sometimes we work out, we do yoga. There's lots of different things we can do. And I think the guiding principle here is that video games, another one, yes. The guiding principle here is that when we're distracting or trying to do something that just helps us escape for a little while, the trick is to not overuse that as a technique. So if we sleep too much, if we just stream our favorite TV show all day, if we just play video games all day, right, then what happens is we avoid dealing with the problem, and that ends up creating more stress. The flip side of that is that when we are really stressed out, sometimes taking a pause and just giving ourselves that hour to play that video game, listen to music, all those kinds of things can be really helpful. So whether it's sleeping or any of the things we just talked about, the key is do it in moderation, do it in a way that's healthy, and do it in a way that doesn't interfere with your ability to solve the problems that are causing you stress. All right. So I see that the chat and Q&A are slowing down. And so I think we are going to wrap up for today. But I want to thank you again for coming. It was a pleasure to be here with you, and I really hope that you found something useful in this presentation. I can't thank you enough for all of your participation. It is so cool to be in front of students again. It's been a while since I was a professor, and I'm very glad to be teaching. So hope you have a wonderful day, and thanks so much for coming.